January 26, 1945. The town of Holtzwihr, France, sat buried under thick snow as 6 German Panzer tanks rumbled toward American positions. Lieutenant Audie Murphy watched from his command post as the lead tank's gun swiveled toward his men with deadly intent. Then the first shell hit with devastating effect. The M10 tank destroyer erupted in flames, ammunition cooking off inside. Murphy's company scattered as German infantry poured out of the woods behind the advancing armor like a grey wave. 250 German soldiers against Murphy's remaining force of just 18 men, most of them green replacements who had never seen combat before this morning. Murphy ordered his men to fall back to the tree line 300 yards behind them for safety. Every single one of them obeyed the order immediately. Everyone except Murphy himself, who had different plans. The 19-year-old lieutenant walked alone across the frozen field toward the burning tank destroyer. Machine gun fire kicked up snow around his boots as he advanced. Artillery shells screamed overhead, impacting nearby. The tank destroyer's ammunition was cooking off violently, sending rounds exploding in every direction randomly. Murphy climbed onto the burning vehicle without hesitation, grabbed the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on top, and swung it toward the advancing German infantry closing in. What happened next would defy every military expert's understanding of what one human being could accomplish under fire. But then the experts had been catastrophically wrong about Audie Murphy from the very beginning of his story. 3 years earlier, on the day after Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, a 17-year-old kid from rural Texas walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office. Determination burned in his eyes despite his appearance. The recruiter took one look at him and burst out laughing at what he saw. Audie Murphy stood 5 foot 5 inches tall and weighed exactly 112 pounds soaking wet. He looked more like a high school freshman than a warrior ready for combat. The Marine recruiter didn't even bother with the physical examination required. "Come back when you grow up, son," he said dismissively. Murphy tried the Army paratroopers next with the same result. Too small, too light for jumping. Next applicant. The Navy turned him away without a second glance at his small frame. "We need sailors, not children," they told him bluntly. But Murphy refused to quit trying to enlist. He'd grown up dirt poor in Texas during the Great Depression, one of 12 children in a sharecropper family. His father had abandoned them when times got hard. His mother died when Murphy was just 16 years old. He'd kept his younger siblings alive by hunting game, trapping, and picking cotton for pennies. He'd learned young that you don't stop just because something's hard or seems impossible. War wasn't an adventure to Murphy like it was for some recruits. It was a job that needed doing, period. So when the regular army finally accepted him in June 1942, he knew it was only because his older sister Corinne had forged documents. Documents saying he was 18 instead of 17 to meet the minimum age. The drill instructors at Camp Walters, Texas, took one look at the baby-faced recruit and assumed he'd wash out within a week. During bayonet training, larger soldiers knocked him down repeatedly like he was a toy. On the obstacle course, he struggled to climb walls his longer-limbed comrades scaled easily. "That boy's going to get himself killed in combat," one sergeant told another with certainty. "He's got heart, but heart don't stop bullets or artillery. Send him to cook school or something safe." Murphy shipped out with the 3rd Infantry Division in February 1943, despite the doubts. The veteran soldiers made bets on how long the 112-pound teenager would last in actual combat. Most gave him less than a week before he'd break. They were catastrophically wrong in their assessment. Murphy's first combat came during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 under fire. While other soldiers hugged the ground under German machine gun fire, Murphy low-crawled forward alone, flanked a stone farmhouse and killed 2 German soldiers with his M1 carbine before the rest even knew he was inside the building. His company commander stared at the skinny teenager standing amid 4 dead Germans in shock. "Murphy, what the hell were you thinking?" the captain asked. "They were in our way, sir," Murphy replied simply. This pattern repeated itself across Sicily, Italy, and into France through brutal campaigns. Murphy's small size became an advantage in combat. He could slip through terrain larger men couldn't navigate easily. His childhood hunting made him a deadly accurate shot with any weapon. His poverty-forged toughness meant he could endure conditions that broke other men completely. By January 1945, Murphy had earned a battlefield commission to second lieutenant despite his age. He'd been wounded 3 times in combat. The third wound in October 1944 nearly killed him outright. A sniper's bullet tore through his hip, shattering bone. The wound developed gangrene, and Murphy spent months in a hospital fighting the infection desperately. Doctors debated amputation of his leg. They finally cleared him to return to duty in mid-January 1945, after months of recovery. Murphy rejoined Company B just 12 days before the battle at Holtzwihr began. He was still limping from the hip wound that hadn't fully healed. Any reasonable officer would have taken more time to recover strength. Murphy wasn't reasonable about duty. His men needed him, and he'd never walked away from a job that needed doing. The sergeants who'd laughed at him in basic training were now saluting him as an officer, but his biggest test was still ahead in the frozen fields of France. Murphy's company had been reduced to just 18 men by the time they reached the frozen woods outside Holtzwihr. Most of the combat veterans were dead or wounded. The replacements were teenagers who'd never heard a shot fired in anger at all. On January 26th at dawn, the German attack came without warning. 6 Panzer tanks emerged from the morning fog with 250 infantry advancing behind them in formation. Murphy called for artillery support immediately and ordered his tank destroyers forward to engage. The first M10 took a direct hit from a German Panzer's main gun. Flames engulfed the vehicle as the crew scrambled out desperately. Murphy's second tank destroyer reversed rapidly, but German infantry had already flanked the American positions from the woods. Murphy's 40 men were about to be surrounded and annihilated. The radio operator's face went white with fear. "Lieutenant, we got to pull back. There's too many of them attacking." Murphy made the decision that would define his entire life in that moment. "Everyone fall back to the tree line. Artillery observer stays with me to direct fire." His men didn't want to leave him alone, but Murphy made it a direct order they had to follow. As his company retreated toward the woods for cover, Murphy walked forward through machine gun fire, walked toward the burning tank destroyer sitting exposed. The burning tank destroyer sat in the middle of an open field with no cover for 300 yards in any direction. German machine gun fire swept across the frozen ground in continuous bursts. The tank destroyer's ammunition was cooking off, sending rounds exploding in random directions around the vehicle. Murphy climbed onto the burning vehicle without hesitation. Flames licked up from the engine compartment below. The metal deck was hot enough to burn through boot soles on contact. Smoke poured from every opening in the vehicle. Standing on top of this burning ammunition dump, Murphy grabbed the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, swung it toward the advancing Germans who were closing distance. The first burst cut down 3 German soldiers immediately. Murphy adjusted his aim and fired again, killing 4 more. The Germans had assumed the burning tank destroyer was abandoned and harmless. Suddenly it had become a deadly fortress with a lone defender who refused to die. Bullets sparked off the tank destroyer's armor plating around Murphy. Rounds whistled past his head close enough to hear. An artillery shell landed 10 yards away, showering him with frozen dirt and shrapnel fragments. Murphy kept firing methodically at targets. This is where something impossible by military standards began to happen on that field. Murphy's small size, the very thing that had gotten him rejected by every military branch, suddenly became a devastating tactical advantage. On top of that tank destroyer, he presented a smaller target than a larger man would have presented. His years of hunting rabbits and squirrels had taught him to track multiple targets simultaneously with precision. His poverty-forged toughness meant he could ignore the flames burning his feet and the smoke choking his lungs. But it was more than just physical advantages he possessed. Murphy had spent his entire life being underestimated by everyone who saw him. Every drill instructor who'd predicted he'd fail. Every soldier who'd bet he wouldn't last a week in combat. Every German who'd looked at the baby-faced lieutenant and assumed he'd break easily under pressure. Murphy had built a career proving people wrong about his capabilities. The Germans tried flanking maneuvers to get around him. Murphy spotted them instantly and called down artillery fire through the field radio, directing strikes within 50 yards of his own position dangerously close. They tried massing for a direct frontal assault. Murphy's .50 caliber cut them down in groups before they could close distance. They tried having tanks target him specifically with main guns. Murphy kept firing even as Panzer shells exploded around the burning vehicle he stood on. For 1 full hour, Audie Murphy stood on that burning tank destroyer and held off an entire German company by himself. Then Murphy felt the impact in his right leg, a sharp pain. A German machine gun burst had found its mark finally. Blood soaked through his pants immediately. The leg buckled slightly from the wound, but Murphy locked his knee and kept firing without stopping. The ammunition belt feeding the .50 caliber was running dangerously dry. Murphy fired the last rounds in controlled bursts, making every single bullet count. When the gun finally went silent with the belt empty, he'd been on top of that burning tank destroyer for over an hour. The German attack had stalled completely, momentum broken. Bodies littered the frozen field in front of his position. Witnesses later counted over 40 dead Germans in the immediate vicinity, with total casualties exceeding 50 killed or wounded from one man's fire. One man armed with 1 machine gun had stopped an attack by 6 tanks and 250 infantry soldiers. Murphy climbed down from the tank destroyer carefully. His right leg nearly collapsed under him from the wound. The artillery observer stared at Murphy like he was seeing a ghost walking. "Lieutenant, you're hit badly," he said in shock. "I noticed," Murphy replied calmly. Murphy limped 300 yards back to his company's position through the snow. His men emerged from cover, several crying openly at seeing him alive and walking. Instead of seeking medical attention for his wound, Murphy organized his men for a counterattack immediately. Despite his wounded leg, despite the burns on his feet, despite having just survived an hour of combat that should have killed him 10 times over, Murphy led his 18 men forward. They drove the remaining Germans out of Holtzwihr completely. Only after securing the objective did Murphy allow a medic to examine his leg wound properly. He'd been standing on that burning tank destroyer for 20 minutes with a bullet hole through his calf. Nobody had known, because Murphy hadn't stopped fighting or shown any sign. The official after-action reports from Holtzwihr read like fiction to anyone who reviewed them. Officers reviewing Murphy's citation for the Medal of Honor initially questioned whether the accounts were exaggerated or fabricated. One man on top of a burning vehicle, holding off 250 German soldiers and 6 tanks for an hour alone. It defied military doctrine and common sense about what was possible, but there were 18 American witnesses and captured German soldiers who confirmed every single detail. Some of the German prisoners specifically asked to meet the officer who'd stopped their attack so effectively. When they saw the slight baby-faced lieutenant, several refused to believe it was him. They'd assumed they'd been facing a reinforced company with heavy weapons and support, not one teenager with a machine gun on a burning vehicle. The Medal of Honor was presented to Murphy by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch on June 2, 1945, near Salzburg, Austria, after the war in Europe ended, but the Medal of Honor was just the beginning of his decorations. By the war's end, Murphy had received every combat decoration the United States could award its soldiers. France awarded him the Legion of Honor. Belgium gave him the Belgian Croix de Guerre for valor. In total, Audie Murphy received 33 awards and medals, making him the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II. The teenager who'd been too small to enlist had become a one-man wrecking crew, who'd killed an estimated 240 German soldiers across 2 years of continuous combat operations. He'd been wounded 3 times, each time returning to duty. He'd fought in 9 major campaigns across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. At age 21, when the war ended, Murphy was already a living legend. After the war, Murphy's story caught Hollywood's attention immediately. Actor James Cagney saw Murphy's picture on the cover of Life magazine and invited him to California. Murphy's film career culminated in 1955, when he starred in To Hell and Back playing himself. The movie became Universal's highest-grossing film until Jaws 20 years later broke the record. But fame couldn't silence the nightmares that haunted him. Murphy suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1940s nobody had a name for it yet. He slept with a loaded .45 pistol under his pillow every night. He had violent nightmares that woke him screaming. What made Murphy's struggle particularly cruel was that America wanted its heroes to be invulnerable and perfect. Murphy became an advocate for better treatment of veterans' psychological wounds decades before it was acceptable, speaking openly about his struggles when nobody else in his position would admit weakness. On May 28, 1971, Murphy died in a plane crash in Virginia at age 45. The man who'd survived being shot 3 times, who'd stood on a burning tank destroyer against an entire German company, who'd walked through 2 years of the deadliest war in human history, died in a random accident. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, with full military honors befitting his service. His gravesite became one of the most visited at Arlington, second only to President Kennedy's memorial. Today, veterans stop by Murphy's grave regularly to salute him. Tourists bring their children to tell them about the boy who was too small to fight, but became the most decorated soldier in American history through courage. The stone is simple, listing his name, his rank, and his dates. It doesn't list his 33 medals or accomplishments. It doesn't need to explain anything. The military establishment that laughed at Murphy in 1942 studied his tactics for decades afterward. His one-man stand at Holtzwihr became required reading at officer training schools across America. Not because it should be replicated by other soldiers. The army was careful to note that Murphy's actions were extraordinarily reckless by doctrine, but because it demonstrated what's possible when courage, skill, and absolute refusal to surrender combine in a single person. Murphy's story has become mythology in American military culture, but the facts are more powerful than any myth could ever be. A 112-pound teenager who was rejected by every military branch he tried. A soldier who had documents forged just to serve his country. A lieutenant who stood alone on a burning tank destroyer for an hour and stopped an entire German company. But Murphy's greatest legacy might be what he represented to everyone who's been underestimated based on their appearance alone. Every short kid who was told they couldn't compete physically. Every thin teenager who was told they weren't tough enough for challenges. Every person from poverty who was told their background would prevent success in life. Murphy proved that what matters isn't what other people think you can do based on size. What matters is what you refuse to stop trying to accomplish despite obstacles. The recruiters were wrong about him. The drill instructors were wrong. The soldiers who bet Murphy wouldn't last a week in combat were catastrophically wrong in their assessment. The German forces at Holtzwihr, who assumed the small American lieutenant would break easily under pressure, they learned their error at a cost of 50 casualties on a frozen field. Audie Murphy spent his entire life being told he was too small to matter by everyone. He responded by mattering more than almost anyone else of his generation through actions. That's not just a war story from 1945. That's a lesson that never gets old or loses relevance. The people who get rejected the hardest often become the ones who change history forever. Murphy's grave reminds us that true heroism has nothing to do with physical size or appearance. The man everyone said was too weak to fight became the soldier who wouldn't stop fighting no matter what.